thinking blind to what's going on. They're effing terrified. They can't sleep. They go to work. They're expected to be at work. And the best part, they go home, drink a half a bottle of vodka in 10 minutes, eat dinner, talk to the kids, eat some Xanax by the handful, and then bail, try to sleep, can't, repeat the next day, repeat. It was astonishing stuff coming from people. This is someone running a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund who was normally, whatever normal means anymore, one of the most sane people I know, very level-headed, very straightforward. But this is the depths to which people had been reduced. So for me, this was real fear. This was the feeling like, something incredibly important was happening, and yet most people were just seeing sort of the tips of it. So it was astonishing. So what I thought I could do is sort of walk you through a little bit of. Or just advance it. That'll work. So I may have to run back and forth. So for me, this was a bit of a Tacoma Narrows moment. Most of you, or maybe many of you, know the whole story of Tacoma Narrows. It was a bridge in Washington State that, under the response of sort of a very steady wind at a particular speed, great story in civil engineering. I'm a lapsed engineer. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm a lapsed engineer. So I was an engineer way back when, and then drummed out of the Corps. And so this bridge, under the influence of very steady wind at a particular velocity, sort of hit the resonant frequency of the bridge, caused these incredible oscillations that eventually tore the bridge to pieces. In many ways, that's what I felt like was happening in capital markets, in part sort of manifested by that note and is shown by that note, but was happening in September, October of 2008. What we had was a dynamic system, the economy, which under the influence of some unusual forces at an unusual time in an unusual way, was actually not just going through one of these periodic oscillations that capital markets are prone to do. We all say, booms, bust, booms, bust. That this was something really unusual. This was a capital market, in a sense, rearing up like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, and in a sense, trying to tear itself to pieces. This was, epic and crazy stuff. So at the same time as this was happening, I was on CNBC. I do 2 days a week on CNBC, inside of these octaboxes, as John Stewart calls it. And so you're shouting at random strangers who you can't see, and it's great fun, and you shout back and forth. But there was something crazy at this particular time when we're shouting back and forth inside these octaboxes. It was like we were shouting back and forth at each other in octaboxes at the same time as just right beside us, Tacoma Narrows, in this case, the United States and maybe most of the OECD and the Western world, were busy blowing up. And it was like, we're standing here shouting at each other inside of these octaboxes, and the world's screwed. Everything's just going to hell and it's all blowing up. It was, for me, it was a surreal and unusual feeling. But that was very much the sense that I had that was sort of what was going on. So, in part, one of the explanations for this sort of thing, my fear of what was going on, was in this sort of, there's a great book called The Collapse of Complex Civilizations by a guy named Joseph Tainter. If you get a chance, read it. Make sure you do it. Read it mostly in daylight. And so what he talks about in The Collapse of Complex Civilizations is that there's sort of returning, there's increasing benefits and then sort of diminishing benefits to societies as they become more complex, as they start sort of pulling together all of the strands that let us do the things like what we're doing today, video and talking and traveling around on airplanes. But after a while, the costs of creating these complex civilizations climb to the point that it's kind of a wash, right? As we spend more and societies get more complex, the returns from the complexity sort of begin to fall off. We kind of hit peak complexity. Things don't actually, we're not getting the same benefits as we once did. A lot of people argued that this is what was happening, that really under the hood, because this is what's important for us as we think going forward, what was really going on? Was this just Wall Streeters run amok? Was this too many MIT physics grads who went off to Wall Street and blew up the world? Which is, one of the stories that we always heard. What was going on under the hood that was making things nuts and crazy? And so, in one sense, that was one of the pieces. The other kind of piece that was going on here at the same time is this, as an economy, we're prone to going through these waves of mass extinctions, much like what's happened in sort of the geological time. We've gone through sort of 5 periods of mass extinction over time, where the system sort of falls apart under its own weight. It's very easy to turn this into kind of a cute just so story and say, oh, well, capitalism, Schumpeter, creative destruction, bam, I win, right? You just say those 3 things and all of a sudden everything's okay, as if, just reciting those lines makes it all right. It's not. This was a very, very different and very dangerous moment, because we were going through something that in capitalism we hadn't seen since the 1920s. No one alive really had any experience with it. Everything that we were seeing was brand new to most of the people who were working out there. But really what was happening was this kind of mass extinction under the influence of increasing complexity, finally falling apart under its own way and blowing apart in real time as we watch. Fantastically exciting, but at the same time, sort of producing all these crazy emails to me. If you could take a forward one. And the funny thing, though, is, for me in part, is as humans, we're really, really bad with collapse for obvious reasons, but we're bad to the precursors to collapse. Because what are the precursors to collapse? Well, what were the precursors to collapse in the case of Tacoma Narrows? The precursors to collapse were volatility. These oscillations, they grew and grew and grew, these undamped oscillations in a sort of a classic physics sense. In the economy, we had the exact same thing. We were having these days with 8 and 9% swings in either direction in the stock market. Undamped oscillations are the sign of a very, very unhealthy system, and a system in a sense that's trying to tear itself to pieces. So these undamped oscillations are another piece of it. So as humans, as we look at that, we don't like volatility. Volatility is something that causes us to do all sorts of strange things. And one of my favorite examples, sort of as shown by this wonderful slide, goes back to a puzzle in industrial economics that dates back to the early part of, the early times in industrial economics, but our sort of as a society moved from being a nomadic society to an agrarian society. Economists, who are puzzled by many things, quite rightly, because they have most things wrong, economists have long been puzzled by the transition from nomadic to agrarian societies because, in a sense, because it from a pure average food consumption, sort of average caloric consumption standpoint, it really didn't make sense. It seemed as if people were being fed better as nomads than they were when they moved into urban areas. There's been a lot of work done in this area. It's very interesting. Economists and historians shout at each other. But the bottom line is there's this puzzle. And only recently have we seen some really interesting data explaining in part why this might be. And one of the answers why this might be is because of volatility. And specifically, the issue in volatility is that, think about it, as a nomadic society, your caloric income, your caloric consumption was highly volatile, right? It really depended on sort of droughts, feast, famine, up, down, up it went. So on average, you might have had a higher level, a better capacity to consume food. But for each individual person, they were seeing these incredible swings. And so what gave rise to this was a recent study that showed what are called Harris lines. These are these bone lines that actually existed inside of skeletons unearthed from the time, which are really sort of moments at which the bone growth had ceased and then began again. The classic hallmark of someone, a young person usually, their bone growth is actually ceasing because they're not taking in enough calories, they're not taking in enough food, and it's a sign of someone who's going through a very volatile existence, and it's causing their bones to actually stop growing and then try and catch up again. So this volatility is what we ran from when we ran from being nomads to ran over to being agrarians. In part, there's lots more going on in the story, but it speaks to this whole question of why we fear volatility. We make decisions that outside don't make much sense, but if you think about it in the context of a human facing volatility, we're like, I don't want any part of this. Same thing happened last fall. In the sense, it has parallels back to what happened during this transition from nomad to sort of agrarian times. So, are we all okay now? No, the answer, of course, is absolutely not. We're still likely screwed, but there's reasons for hope. So, let me go through a couple of them real quick. So, this is the classic model for what people think happens. So, what people think happens is we go through these horrible these great big bubbles. We have these cataclysmic moments in the middle, and there's a golden age afterwards. So, of course, cargo cult economics suggests it happened a bunch of other times. If we just blow up the world once, everything will be fine, right? So we just keep repeating the pattern. So let's flip ahead, come back to this in a second. So one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, strangely enough, has to do with lawyers. So if we can take it ahead another one. So the reason why is that our colleague and I were actually doing some mortality studies, completely unrelated, although it's nice, mortality studies and lawyers. And we were trying to estimate across a bunch of different populations in society what percentage of those people are currently alive today. And interestingly enough, when it comes to lawyers, and this is obviously a complete seat-of-the-pants estimate, but we did look at a couple of hundred years of the data we could pull together. Roughly 70% of all lawyers who've ever lived are alive today. Now that's either hugely optimistic, hugely positive thing, terrifying, but no one walks away from that fact unmoved, I think. So what's much more interesting, though, is if you start down this path of thinking about sort of this prodigious creation of professionals in society, it's not just lawyers who are 70% of whom are alive today, scientists and engineers. Scientists and engineers, about 75%. We're producing these people in quantities that we've never produced in the past. Witness this room. For me, that's an incredibly optimistic thing. So we're producing scientists and engineers at a prodigious rate. Reasons for optimism, in part because we were able to network them together and let them collaborate on important problems in ways that we never could before. That's a reason to think that there's something going on here more important than just we're repeating a pattern of blowing up the world and fixing things again. So I had to fix them. Another reason to be sort of optimistic has to do with credit cards. The average American, and I'm sure most of you know this, and I'm not sure what the situation is here, has about 12 credit cards, or had until all the credit card companies went bust. And so they all had about 12 credit cards. And that you can see here in this sort of democratization of credit. This looks back at the total amount of consumer credit in the United States since 1940 and how it sort of climbed this interesting Himalaya all the way up here to about 2008, where I have the you were here sign, because we no longer are there. We've kind of passed this moment of peak credit. But is that a terrible thing? Well, it's an important thing, but think about what's going on under the hood. What really happened here was this democratization of credit. Credit was no longer the plaything of just the wealthy. Think back to the Great Depression. Who was able to get credit? Only the people who didn't really need it. The wealthy could get credit. Now, we like to make jokes about it. You know, this idea of ninja loans. You could get a loan if you had no income, no job, no assets, and a pulse. You could get a loan for a house in the U.S. Ninja. Which was sort of this idea of the democratization of credit. But that's not such a terrible thing. It was terrible in terms of the lengths to which it was taken. But the idea of making credit more widely available to the people in this room and many others has all kinds of important implications, not least that we've gone from 40 years ago, roughly 30%, 25-30% of the small companies in the U.S. could trace their roots back to being founded on credit cards. Now, it's up to about 58% of the companies in the U.S., early stage, small companies in the U.S., found their first funding through credit cards, including Google, who went out and bought their first terabyte drive for something like $15,000, I think they told me. $15,000 for their first drive. They had to put it on Sergey and Larry's joint, like 3 credit cards or something like this to go out and purchase it, but it was really the founding moment for the company. So democratization of credit, while it gets a really bad name, is incredibly important. Why? Because it opens up avenues for people who are otherwise unable to get credit to get it, sometimes for silly reasons and nonsensical and dangerous reasons, but not always. So let's loop back to the beginning again. So what do we think about this model now? Do we think that this is sort of just cargo cult stuff, or are there reasons to be optimistic that there's some things, important things going on in the economic growth? I'm arguing yes, there are. I'm arguing, and if you flip, I think I summarized them on the next page. Yeah. So I'm arguing that the democratization of credit is going overlooked, incredibly important, something that can continue to drive small business growth, and small business is really the source of innovation and entrepreneurship. That this kind of idea of peak science, that we've never gone through a cycle like this, a credit cycle and a capital market cycle, and come out the other side with so many. Think of scientists as weaponry, and so many weapons pointed at the same problems at the same time. It sounds a bit silly, but that's really what's going on. We've got sort of this coordinated army of people, problem solvers, all focused on the same problem at the same time. For me, that's hugely optimistic. Hugely optimistic. Never happened before in the history of sort of modern capitalism. And finally, this whole idea of cycles does have some merit. We've blown away an awful lot of the underbrush, much like in the sense of sort of a wildfire raging through. It's collapsing under its own weight, whether it wants to or not. We could no longer produce reasonable returns for all the complexity we were creating. Complexity collapses. We can begin climbing the curve again. For me, these are 3 reasons to be optimistic. Thanks.